Three. All right. Hello, Dan. Welcome to the Hub. Excited to have you on.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to chat with you.
Yeah. So let's dive right on into it. So can you tell us a little bit about why you love guns? It's a timely episode, and I could have asked. There's some people in my family that grew up with guns. They really like guns, but I thought of you because we had a discussion during our MBA program. I don't know if you remember, but I came away thinking like, oh no, Dan knows this subject. He's researched it. He listens. He can understand the other side. But you articulated well why you are a gun enthusiast. So maybe you could help my listeners, understand why you're a gun enthusiast.
Yeah. Hopefully I can do as good of a job second time around. I'm glad it was, somewhat impactful for you back when we were in the MBA program. I think a lot of the reason why we have such a polar kind of view of things with guns is the kind of disparity in experiences that people have.
Mhm.
And so I'll give you a little bit of my background so that it makes a little bit more sense for you and for your listeners. The long story short, or the too long didn't read it version of why I love guns is I'm from Idaho. In some ways that's enough said, but I think let me dive into it a little bit more. In my family, when you turn 12, when you're a boy, you turn 12, you get a BB gun. Actually, sorry, when you turn 8, you get a BB gun. When you turn 12, you generally get a 22 rifle, a 22 caliber rifle. And then somewhere around 14 or 15, you get a hunting rifle for hunting deer or big game. And then, a little bit older, 16, you generally get a 12 gauge shotgun. So for people who are from, maybe a bigger city or who are from places that's not common, that might seem a little intense. That might seem a little crazy, but that's the way that, my dad giving me those gifts, it was a way for him to show me he's respected me and that, we were going to spend time together and we were going to learn how to use these tools. And it was a way that my mom was able to communicate that she trusted me. There is an element of danger with guns always. And so for them to entrust me with that was a sign of respect, of love, of trust. And it's something that just part of who I was as I grew up was hunting and shooting and having fun with my dad doing that kind of thing. So it's something that from very young has been very comfortable for me to use guns in a safe way. And so when I meet somebody who has never shot a gun or who has only shot a gun on a couple of occasions, it starts to make sense a little bit why they're more apprehensive or why they don't necessarily have the same feelings towards guns that I do.
Yeah, totally. Two thoughts. One, I think my dad's from Idaho, and he gave me a 22 when I was 12 as well. And having not grown up in Idaho, we were living in Ohio at the time. I don't think the culture, the significance, I remember my dad being like, hey, this is a big deal, But for me, I was just like, sweet, I got a gun, it wasn't the same. And I feel like I missed out on it, the significance of him giving me that 22 because I wasn't in Idaho. I wasn't in that, kind of culture a little bit of like, hey, yeah, this is an important part of like, your childhood kind of thing.
Yeah, I definitely think the teaching and stuff and the expectation of it helps. My dad built a gun cabinet out of wood and glass in wood shop when he was in high school, and he kept all his guns in there. So the time I could walk and see and understand what things were, that was something I would crawl over and look at, and I saw it growing up. And so it's, to me, it's a beautiful piece of art that's been in our house. And so I don't know, like I'm saying, it's something that's really ingrained in my life is to see guns and use guns.
Yeah, totally. Well, and the other thing that the other thought was similar to swimming in water. My wife and I went to Hawaii, and while we were there, one of the locals was talking about being out in the ocean, and he said, water confidence is water safety. And I think that applies a lot to guns and how you view guns and how you handle guns. If you grew up with guns, if you respect them, if you view them more as a tool or, part of the equipment to go hunting and you're familiar with them, you understand them, like that's gun confidence. And that translates to gun safety. They're locked up.
Yeah, 100%.
And, but, for someone who has never swam before, the ocean's scary. And someone who's never been around a gun before or never had that experience growing up, guns are scary because they are lethal, So
Yeah.
yeah, it's just interesting the experiences and people that we have, like the upbringing that we have, and we view things differently, which I guess you could argue like, okay, well, maybe we should have gun safety courses in high school instead of woodworking or health. I don't know, but
Yeah.
I
I
don't
mean,
really
there's lots
see.
of ways to kind of approach getting people more comfortable. I also think there's a lot of things that we could improve on in making sure that a broader swath of Americans are comfortable with guns. You look at some of the other countries with the highest levels of gun ownership and gun safety and the lowest levels of gun crime out there, and they're countries where mandatory military service for men and women
Yeah.
is a frequent thing, like Israel or Switzerland, um, where it's something that we try to get across the population. And certainly there are differences, but I think something similar to that would be a good thing for the United States as well.
Yeah. So maybe could you talk a little bit more about the culture of guns in America a little bit? And I know we talked a little bit about this before, but why is gun ownership a big part of the culture? Why is there the Second Amendment as
Yeah,
the part of the Bill of Rights?
I think the Second Amendment really is the answer, right? And the reason for it to begin with. The founding fathers, flawed men as they were, foresaw history repeating itself just as it always had, which is that eventually even governments formed in the best intentions tend to begin to encroach on freedom. And um, you know they saw that America would need in its future time firearms in order to keep a healthy distance and a healthy control over the size and power of the government. That becomes a more foreign concept today as people start to doubt the fact that uh, our country would ever start to encroach on our own rights. But it's just the way history's always been throughout the world. And so that's where politics starts to come into it. I think a little bit is that if you believe the government shouldn't be choosing what is and isn't a human right, then you also start to believe that the people need some form of control over the government. And so I think that's why the Second Amendment came out in the first place. A lot of critics of the Second Amendment will say, well, it was based on the need for a militia, and that's not really a need anymore. And that's where I start to disagree. Is I 100% think it's still applicable. The wording is a well-regulated militia, and I think people think that means the United States Army, which because it's regulated by the government, but that's not what they meant by regulated. It was regulated in the terms of that day meant that it was practiced and disciplined and structured, not that it was regulated by the government. That's why they were called regulars. The soldiers of the day were called regulars because they got together on weekends and they drilled and practiced and they knew how to be safe and accurate with their guns. And I think that's exactly the same thing that the Second Amendment protects today, is the ability for us to continue to be comfortable with firearms, to own firearms, and to step up and make sure the government stays where it needs to stay if the need ever arises.
Yeah, no, it's well said. I've been reading a book that talks about Western civilization and the relationship to military and arms, and it's always interesting. Like, in most of the world, well, I guess except for this exception, government is usually like the rule of a few over many, right? It's usually a dictator or a party or something. And it's been only in the last couple hundred years where it's been kind of a, constrained constitutional type government. But besides that, it's mostly been, a couple of people at top ruling over the masses. And maybe the advent of being able to defend yourself, and I think also the Western push of the US, right? There were settlers that were going west and they didn't really have protection from the government. It was just them and the guns that they had. So I think that helped in the culture as well.
Yeah, I think the other thing that's important is that we don't only own guns today because we're afraid the government is going to come oppress us. We own guns to be able to protect ourselves in any sense of the word from anybody. But we just believe that it's our right to do so and that we don't have to wait for the police to come 20 minutes later or not at all to be able to be safe. And so I think that that's something we view as fundamental to being an American.
Well said. Well said. All right, but switching gears a little bit. So I think you articulated well, kind of the viewpoint of owning guns, gun enthusiasts. But what about when people see these mass shootings and,
Yeah.
and the common phrase is like, oh man, if we need to regulate guns, we need to make sure guns aren't right. Violence is a universal human characteristic, but you can only hurt so many people with your fists. You can only hurt so many people with knives. Whereas if you have a gun, the capacity to hurt or kill a lot of people, and specific people at that too, it changes the calculus. What would you say to that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think you'd be hard pressed to find even a gun enthusiast that's in favor of a mass shooting. I mean, nobody's trying to argue that we keep them around, right? It's a question of what are our priorities, and are we actually being fed the right information here? Just to put a little bit of perspective, generally in the last several years in the United States, we've had about somewhere between 33 and 40,000 deaths by firearm in any given year. And 60% of those roughly are suicide. So you get down to, after you remove suicides and homicide by the police, which is also a fairly small number, you get left with like 37% of deaths being caused by firearm homicide, which, let's say roughly is about 15,000 a year. If you look at mass shootings by any definition that's commonly used today, and that's another thing we can talk about, is the way we define a mass shooting, but by even the most generous, definition, you're talking about 600 people out of 15,000. And so, yes, mass shootings are horrendous and they are scary, but the idea that mass shootings is the thing that we should all be worried about, the thing that we should be creating changes to the Bill of Rights in order to be able to control, when there's 600 out of 15,000, that's where you start to get people pushing back and disagreeing with the idea of these certain gun restrictions or gun laws that are supposed to help us control mass shootings. But even if you put that aside and say that our number one goal should be to address mass shootings instead of other violent crime, the controls that are being suggested in many cases are like magazine capacity or assault rifle bans. But even if you look at those 600 on the more generous side, the majority of those are not used, they're not being, we would not be affected by the gun control laws being suggested. We're talking about around 300 people a year killed by rifles, period, and only some small subset of that being assault rifles. And so these rules wouldn't do anything. And so I guess what the calculus starts to look like for somebody who believes in the Second Amendment is, okay, I'm going to see limitations to myself because I'm a law-abiding citizen, and I'm not going to see any change in mass shootings, and I'm certainly not going to see any drop in overall homicides. Right. And so then when that doesn't work, they'll come back with another restriction, which also won't work. And so we get in this vicious cycle of regulation and no actual impact. And so if you actually want to start talking about making an impact of regulation, at least it would be nice to see people talking about the broader problem of homicide by firearm and not simply mass shootings. Homicide by firearm, as I mentioned, like 15,000 a year, the vast majority are committed with low capacity magazine, low caliber handguns. And so the idea that we're talking about banning high capacity magazines, banning assault rifles, when we're talking about 10,000 deaths by handguns versus 300 by rifles, that's where it starts to get insane for somebody who believes in gun rights and the Second Amendment.
So are you saying that there's an element of how mass shootings are portrayed because they are highly sensationalized, right? Are you saying there's a little bit of a narrative, like we don't really hear about the homicide deaths at all?
Yeah, 100%. I think, we hear about how there's been, I don't know how many, some people say 400, 500 mass shootings by the end of the year. And as I mentioned earlier, there's really no set definition for what a mass shooting is. So as I mentioned, I've got a link I can share with the listeners here, but it kind of summarizes the different ways, different sources define a mass shooting. And it really, there's three dimensions what you can classify something as a mass shooting against. First, the number of people who are injured or killed. Obviously, most people agree that number is right around 4 people. The different sources will determine whether that includes injuries or just deaths. But the second dimension is, was it public or private? Meaning, is this a public area? Is this right out in the street, in a public office building, or is this perpetrated within somebody's home on private property? And then the third category is, what was the motive? Is this an indiscriminate thing where people just entered an office building and went to kill somebody for no reason, or targeted somebody in specific, but really their only goal was to kill? Or is it part of a separate crime or felony? Meaning, was this part of a bank robbery, a drug transaction, something like that, or domestic violence being another one? So that's where I said you get a big, broad range. If you use the more strict definitions, which is it has to be 4 deaths or more in public with no motive other than to kill. In 2019, there were 6 mass shootings by that definition. But if you talk about 4 or more injuries in public or private, and for any motive, that's when you start to see like 500 people killed in like 60 to 70 mass shootings. So that's where there's so much misinformation and disagreeing over what really is the problem. But like I said, even if you take the more generous definition, it's still a tiny fraction of the people that are killed by firearms or by any method other than firearms, for that matter.
So what would you, let's say the broader definition, what kind of gun regulations would you be in favor of if maybe not just specifically targeting mass shootings, but just homicide or gun violence in general? What type of reforms or gun regulations would you like to see?
Yeah, 100%. This is a great question. And I think you already mentioned kind of the key there is you have to target homicide in general, and how you can try to reduce that number, not specifically mass shootings. And so I think something that most people, even Second Amendment staunch gun rights advocates will agree with is that we want to keep guns out of the hands of criminals. And so we already have background checks almost universally across the board. I think the systems which those background checks use are frequently not as up to date as they can be. So I think the idea of a more stringent and powerful background check is a great idea. But at the end of the day, we've still seen most, mass shootings are not perpetrated by criminals. They're perpetrated by first-time offenders. Mm-hmm. But like I said, the bigger picture of reducing homicides is continue to background check anybody wanting to purchase a firearm. And I think the other thing is increasing the penalty for illegal possession of a firearm. If you are in possession of a firearm and you're not legally allowed to have that, then that needs to be a high-level felony with some serious jail time, so that you can make it difficult for people to get their hands on guns when they shouldn't. All that being said, none of this is really, really going to make a major impact on crime, because criminals at the end of the day don't care about the law. Right. They've already decided they're going to break it. And so you have to start looking at what is the root cause of homicide in our country. And so the biggest factor there is the war on drugs. If you can figure out a way to defund the drug trade to a certain extent by potentially legalizing and regulating drugs in the United States, you defund all the violent gangs and cartels inside and outside the United States who have raised the level of violence across the board. That's one way I would see making a meaningful impact on homicide, guns or otherwise, in the U.S.
So you're just saying just let all drugs in, legalize it, tax it, and gun violence will go away.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's quite as black and white as that, but I think if you start to meaningfully regulate and legalize drugs in some sense in the United States, I mean, we've seen the first steps with marijuana, and I think that the likelihood of other things following is probably high. You remove the incentive or the need for violence in the industry. Yeah. If there's no money to be made because it's legal, then there's no reason to defend it with violence and crime. We saw the same thing happen with prohibition, right? I mean, Al Capone and organized crime basically was completely funded by and motivated by illegal bootleg alcohol sales. Yeah. Right. And so obviously that didn't work. And I think we can be honest with ourselves. The war on drugs, quote unquote, has been an unmitigated failure for the past, 50, 60 years. It's not like anybody's ever stopped doing drugs since we started making them illegal and policing them. So the demand seems to be there regardless. And I think, sure, we're not going to get rid of all homicide, but we can get rid of a massive swath of it, and start to realize that it's not guns that are the problem, it's violent crime.
And like you said, this market that we've made illegal or, made it a black market has caused it to, has all these other repercussions such as gang violence, crime, and other things. You enforce order by guns, right? You know, you have to maintain the order in the market. And if it's not in the, if it's not a regulated an open market in the public's eye, generally you're doing that through, guns.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the example of that is that you look at, I mean, people believe that guns are what drives violent crime, but it's just not factually true. I mean, you look at a state like Vermont, which has very, very little crime at all. I mean, in 2012, they had 8 total homicides, only 2 of which involved a firearm, yet nearly 75% of the population lives in a household with firearms in it. So how do you explain the fact that gun ownership there is higher than the national average, and yet crime, and gun crime for that matter, is well below? And yet a city like Chicago, which has some of the strongest gun laws and gun bans in the entire country, is the epicenter of basically an all-out street war day to day. I mean, it's because crime is the driver, not gun ownership.
Well said. What about, what the critics would say, what about other places like England or Australia that have passed stricter gun control and seen gun violence deteriorate, go down?
Yeah, let's talk about Australia first off. I mean, they had their mass shooting in 1996, which was the big catalyst for their gun buyback and gun regulation. First off, their gun buyback only achieved getting about a third of the guns off the streets, supposedly. But people will still tout that as a huge success because this major downtick in gun violence from 96 until the present. But if you zoom out a little bit and look at the prior history, if you go back to like even the early 80s, you'll see that same exact downward trend in gun violence in Australia, with very little inflection at all in 96 when they actually banned a lot of guns. So the reality is external factors like what we're talking about, economics and development in Australia was really the driver of lower violence in the country. And when there's lower violence, there's lower gun violence. Now, talking about England, people will constantly say like, yeah, they have very little gun violence, which is true. It's an island. And so it's, one thing, they actually are able to control gun levels in their country fairly well. They've been extremely aggressive. And so, yeah, they've gotten gun violence down a lot. However, they have nearly twice the rate of violent homicide per 100,000 residents that the United States does. I mean, they have massive bouts of knife attacks, even mass knife attacks, people getting acid thrown in their face right and left. They have 785 violent crimes per 100,000 residents in a year, and the United States only has 380. So sure, great. You got rid of the gun violence, yet somehow double your country is subject to violent crime compared to the United States.
So it seems like there's more to this issue. And this is why this podcast exists, is to help people, well, just to hear the other side, right? To hear all sides of the argument and to realize like, hey, maybe this is a little bit more complicated than is being portrayed in the media, or, what you read in the newspaper. You're like, oh, it should just be like this. But once you start digging into these issues, you realize, hey, like, this is actually a little bit more complicated than initially thought, than just the headline article, clickbait kind of thing. So,
yeah, I would say that's like, for me, the biggest takeaway from all of this, from learning about these types of things and other things for that matter, is in 2021, the United States has a serious problem with polarity and lack of unity. And I think the problem is that people read the first 2 articles from their favorite news source or Facebook page and assume that they know the truth, when really the world is not that simple of a place. And there's people with powerful motives on both sides of the aisle that are trying to kind of steer your thoughts. And I would say, don't let that happen. Do the deep dive, understand the true facts of the matter, like a semi-automatic weapon ban and a high capacity magazine ban are going to have nil effect on gun deaths in the United States, and try to understand that from a factual basis without letting your emotions about guns or your lack of experience about guns kind of influencing you. And I would say apply that to everything in the world today. Don't allow the clickbait to form your basis of thought. Do the deep research.
Yeah. So 3 main takeaways, if I could sum up for my listeners here. 1, gun regulation is poorly targeted. Doesn't really affect the root of the problem. I guess would be still part of number 1. Number 2, if you really wanted to reduce gun violence, maybe in the war on drugs. And then I guess number 3, I would say gun confidence is gun safety, right? If there's an understanding about guns, if there's a little bit of a respect for them, they become less of a tool of evil, or rather than more just a tool, right? You're just okay. Well, that's well said. I think that's well, I said it, but I guess that's a good summary. But I'm going to do a couple of lightning round type of questions, and then just like
Sure.
we kind of touched on these a little bit, but I kind of want to hear like these were really specific questions that I got from my listeners that I kind of want to run by you. So,
Sure.
as a gun enthusiast, why do you need a semiotic rifle like an AR-15? Why do you need one of those?
Because I believe in having the best there is to defend myself. I mean, if you're a chef, you don't cook over an open flame in your backyard you have a nice stove in your house. You buy the best equipment, and if you believe that people have the right to defend themselves, there's no reason to handicap yourself with worse technology than the people who are coming in your front door are going to have. The best of the best is what you deserve. And secondly, because semi-automatic rifles are, as I mentioned, statistically nowhere near other guns in their ability to commit crime. I mean, so I think that not having it makes no sense at all is really the answer.
Got it. Number two, why, for background checks, why don't we just make them more stringent or lengthen the time from the time you want to purchase to when you can actually get the gun?
Because it will only impact people who would never have committed a crime in the first place.
Okay.
So well, you regulate the law-abiding citizen. You do nothing to prevent the criminal.
Number three, do you think, and this is a little bit about game theory. So, other people have said like, well, more guns is more safety. And other people hear that and they're like, wait, no, that doesn't sound right. But like you said, if everyone else is armed and you're not armed, you can't defend yourself. You're actually pretty vulnerable. So is the answer maybe to allow more guns, or what would you say? What would you say to that thought?
I think it's pretty difficult to allow any more guns than you do today. I mean, certainly there are certain regulations I'll get rid of, but 300 million guns in the United States is about as much as I think is. I don't think the lack of guns is what's driving crime. I do think that gun familiarity, gun confidence, gun training is in short supply in the U.S. As we mentioned, there's a huge disparity between someone like myself and somebody who grew up in a big city and their experience. And I think we have to close that knowledge gap. And when we close the knowledge gap, at that point, I do think wide swaths of gun ownership is a great way to prevent crime.
Yeah. Well, Dan, thanks for this. Thanks for those answers. They're kind of wrapping up here, and I appreciate you coming on. I would love, maybe I'll have to come, we've talked about this before, but I would maybe love to have your thoughts on like police, guns, and especially the war on drugs. We've seen the war on drugs have a major impact on people of color, Black people. And, we've talked a little bit about, this intersection between, or this correlation between drugs, poverty, crime, and that's where police are. And it would be a real interesting discussion. So maybe in a future episode we can talk about that, because I'm sure you have some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, would be happy to come back on anytime. I think it's the war on drugs is an interesting topic all on its own. I certainly am not somebody who advocates consumption of drugs. I'm heavily against it in any form. Like gun control, however, I think simply making something illegal does very little to actually prevent any of the negative side, and only regulates the people who have the best of intentions.
Right. And it reminds me of the immigration debate as well, right? You can make immigration illegal, and you have, you create a host of other problems. You have people coming in just trying to escape violence and whatnot. And the people that are getting rich off of it are the people that are, handling or shipping these migrants across the border. They're the
violent criminals.
Yeah, the criminal empires are the ones that are getting rich, and the U.S. government is basically funding them. Their best, the best protector of their criminal empires. So I guess what you're saying is, one, you need to protect against the government, a healthy respect distance between the two, and then two, don't let them regulate because they'll they'll create much more problems than they actually solve. I would say a classic libertarian approach. That's a classic.
Yeah, you can't get really any more libertarian than me unless you're on TV and you're Ron Swanson. So yeah. I think that's accurate.
No, well, again, appreciate you coming on. Listeners, hopefully this was informative. I'll post the links that Dana sent to me. I think they're really interesting in terms of helping us understand that there really is no definition of mass shootings. And, there's statistics out there, but I think this really helps shows that, like, hey, we hear a lot about these shootings, and yes, they're terrible. And, they're not something we should celebrate. We shouldn't trivialize them. However, I think it's also helpful to have a proper perspective and really realize where most of the violence is coming from and where guns are mostly used. And if we have a correct understanding of the problem, then we can, come up with correct solutions. So,
yeah, well said.
So again, Dan, thanks for coming on. Appreciate it. Yeah, we'll see you around.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah. Bye.